Phantom pain, phantom pain, phantom pain. After beating Ground Zeroes, I immediately swapped to my PS4 and started the Phantom Pain. This was kind of jarring, because Ground Zeroes was instant gameplay, then the Phantom Pain decides it's a good idea to throw nearly 2 hours of boring gameplay and exposition at you out of the gate. It takes a little while for you to actually get into the meat of the game, which is just after you rescue Miller. Then everything opens up. Mother Base is a huge component of the Phantom Pain. It's also sort of a worthless one. It's almost exactly the same as Peace Walker, with things mostly existing as fully automated spreadsheets, but this time you can walk around on it. It's just empty. There's very little of worth on Mother Base outside of a handful of story segments. Free roaming on it has no purpose. The story frequently forces you back to Mother Base at arbitrary times, and it feels like it's more to remind you that it exists rather than actually doing anything meaningful. I mostly use these as opportunities to beat the shit out of whoever's in my way en route to my helicopter. Mother Base deals with everything from processing raw materials you find, to providing better mission intel and support via helicopter attacks and artillery strikes. The biggest and most direct draw in day-to-day gameplay is the R&D department, and developing better weapons, upgrading tools, and getting upgrades to your suit like run speed and health regeneration. Yeah. A lot of these things can take a lot of real time to complete. Some things take 10 to 15 minutes, others can take upwards of 2 hours. The main draw of upgrading Mother Base and filling it with kidnapped prisoners is that you can get access to better weapons and equipment via the R&D platform, which leads us right into what I consider to be one of the Phantom Pain's biggest flaws. It becomes apparent very quickly that it is to your benefit to Fulton everything that isn't tied down. Since there's really no consequence to it, it's clearly the optimum strategy. The way soldiers are assigned in Mother Base is automatic based on their stats. Once the platform is filled, extra soldiers just sit in the waiting room. Then, once you upgrade a platform, it'll take the best soldiers from the waiting room and fill it with the best candidates. So the whole scoping out potential candidates from Mother Base is rendered moot. Better soldiers will replace worse ones, and then they'll just sit in the waiting room indefinitely, or until they're dismissed. Fulton Extract not only has the Mother Base development aspect, but it also affects gameplay negatively. Fultoning someone removes them from the battle. No body to be found to rouse suspicion. No risk of them being woken up and rejoining the search to fight you. Fulton extractions also often lure enemies towards the balloon, which means you can just chain knockout into Fulton and repeat until the entire base is cleared. Part of why this is an issue is that there's only a handful of indoor environments in the entire game, which means you're only really restricted to use of the Fulton in a few cases, and most of these are for story reasons. Like a person's injured and won't survive the Fulton extraction, or there are children and you haven't developed a specific Fulton to extract children. Once you unlock the wormhole Fulton, even indoor environments are a non-issue. So Fulton everything even applies to a lot of the missions. There are quite a few missions where you need to follow someone to an objective, but you can just knock them out and Fulton them. Then Mother Base interrogates them and you get the information. It basically makes the game completely mindless. It doesn't matter what your current objective is, you can usually just Fulton it and be successful. You can make the argument that Fulton is limited by your GMP, but I was never in a scenario where I wasn't swimming in it. The only time I ran out of GMP was when I was actively buying every upgrade I could on the way to unlocking the truth ending. Fulton uses so little GMP, and most of the time the things you Fulton, like vehicles and gun emplacements, are worth a lot more. The only thing I think doesn't pay for itself in GMP is the raw resource containers, and those are desirable for different reasons than just GMP. I use all of 3 guns the entire game. The Riot SMG, the AM MRS4 rifle, and the Grom 11 rocket launcher. That was my loadout for the vast majority of missions. I occasionally used a sniper rifle for a handful of missions that strongly encourage it, and some side ops. Basically the idea is that the Riot SMG has more ammo than the Woo tranquilizer pistol, and is more useful if you get into a firefight, because you can inflict knockout easier and faster than you can inflict the sleep status. Headshots with rubber bullets are an instant knockout, just like headshots with the tranquilizer round are instant sleep. Since I wanted to Fulton as much as I could, this was my go-to weapon. It's also silenced, and the range is about the same as the tranquilizer pistol. Then I had the combat rifle as backup and sniping. I usually resorted to this if I got into a big shootout or I didn't feel like Fultoning people, which was usually towards the end of the game. The rocket launcher is just in case there's enemy armor, like tanks or helicopters. It's also useful for very heavily armored infantry and the skulls. I really feel like there's just no reason to take a dedicated sniper rifle except in some very specific circumstances, which I'll explain why in a little bit. If you don't care about Fultoning everyone, you can also just use it to obliterate everything in your path, like I did when I replayed Skullface. For uniforms, once I got the sneaking suit, that's all I used for the majority of the game. For any kind of extreme combat mission, I used the battle dress. I don't really think you need to use any of the other uniforms. So fairly early on, you can unlock the Legendary Gunsmith series of side ops, which eventually give you the ability to customize your guns. This is infinitely more useful than the actual development of better versions of your guns via the R&D department. So the Legendary Gunsmith customization essentially removes the need to choose between a sniper rifle and a rocket launcher. I customized my combat rifle with a 2 to 8 times variable scope the second I unlocked it. This effectively turned my combat rifle into a slightly worse sniper rifle with better firefight capability. So from there I just kept the Grom rocket launcher because it's the most reliable way to take out tanks and helicopters. So there are tons of guns you can use in the Phantom Pain, but I don't see any reason to use many of them. The combat rifles are all just the same with some minor variances for flavor. One gun may have higher damage but no silencer, others may have a high damage but no scope, but once you get customization that largely goes out the window. You can put silencers on guns that don't normally have them and give guns without scopes ones that go on sniper rifles. I think a non-lethal sidearm, a rifle with a 2 to 8 times scope or a red dot plus 2 times magnifier, and a rocket launcher is literally as good as you're going to get in the Phantom Pain. It makes the progression system seem largely worthless. You're upgrading guns mostly for damage, but it seems like the improvements are minimal because it rarely felt like a damage upgrade made it take less bullets to kill someone. You do have to unlock things like scopes and suppressors by upgrading a weapon of the same class, and you need a gunsmith for specific firearms, but at the end of the day, through normal progression you'll unlock scopes and suppressors for most guns. The buddy system is something that kind of felt underwhelming to me. There are really only 2 buddies worth a damn, and that's Quiet and D-Dog. D-Horse and D-Walker are essentially just vehicles. D-Horse is useful early on, but once you progress far enough and have the resources to start a mission with a Jeep or other vehicle, they become worthless. So once I unlocked D-Dog, I never took D-Horse, and I never took D-Walker on a mission. I actually found D-Dog to be significantly more useful than Quiet. D-Dog is essentially wall hacks, and he auto-marks enemies. This was really appealing to me because I'm fairly impatient and I don't like to sit and mark down every enemy in a base before going in. Quiet is a better partner, but a lot of the times she can do things which completely fuck you over. I ran into scenarios where I would be going after a VIP and get spotted just before I grabbed them, and Quiet would promptly crown them, making me lose any potential intel. So it came down to it, if I was going into a combat scenario where I know I was going to get into a firefight, I would take Quiet, otherwise I'd prefer DD because he would make the pace of the battles go faster by auto-marking. So every Metal Gear Solid has some iconic and recognizable characters in the form of the enemy squad you'll be fighting throughout the game. There was Foxhound, Dead Cell, the Cobra unit, the Beauty and the Beast unit. The difference between these and the Parasite unit is they all had backstory. They were all characters. They were all interesting and unique. The Parasite unit is made up of generic super soldiers. They don't have dialogue, they aren't used to forward the plot, they just exist with little to no explanation. They lack a lot of impact. You're also never fighting them one-on-one. It's always in packs of 4. 4 Quiet clones, 4 rock guys, 4 everything else. The battles also feel like they're trying to emulate great battles of previous games but never even come close. The 4 Quiets feel like it wants to be an epic sniper battle, but it lacks the impact of great fights like The End. This kind of expands into the Man on Fire and Skullface, where they just really aren't that interesting, and they feel like they're kind of just shoehorned in. Part of it is that MGS5's combat system just kind of isn't conducive to a boss fight. When you're fighting Quiet or the 4 Quiet clones, you get shot once and you put into critical health, then you just wait. You can't really have an ongoing fight with the regenerating health system. It forces you to stop and hide or run away, which makes every battle kind of like hit and run tactics, which isn't particularly fun. Jumping from PS3 to PS4 led to some pretty significant graphical improvements. It's hard to quantify exactly how much better it looks, but it's basically just a blanket net improvement. The sheer number of times Hideo Kojima's name shows up is insane. I like the games he's made, but I think at this point he was kind of holding back the series. MGS5 was good, don't get me wrong, it was really good. Much in the same way that George Lucas was holding back Star Wars, it was pretty clear that Kojima didn't really have like a wrangler, a guy to say no to him that said this is stupid, we need to do something else here, and it just kind of led to this unfinished product, especially in conjunction with the internal problems at Konami. I'm excited to see what Konami can do with Metal Gear without Kojima, and I'm excited to see what Death Stranding, also known as Norman Reedus with a fetus, has in store. I hate when microtransactions are shoehorned into largely single-player games. MGS5 has some in the form of your forward operating base. So your forward operating base acts as like a secondary mother base. You can use it to improve your R&D, your medical support teams, everything like that. It's exactly the same as mother base, just a little smaller in scale. It's mandatory you buy a forward operating base in the main game, and you're given Kojima coins to do so. For the most part, you can ignore it. which is good. But every time I was doing forward operating based stuff or the online deployment missions and the instant completion with real money shows up, I get a little miffed. It just has no place in Metal Gear Solid 5. It has no place really in any single player game, and you know I gotta talk about it because I hate it. And you know I'll never pay money for stuff like this, and it just makes me mad that it's in there. Because you know you pay $70, you pay $70 in Monopoly money, and then they kind of try to nickel and dime you for improved services, and that's not a business practice I appreciate. I mean, other than that stuff, the presentation is great. You know, your on-screen text is useful. The cutscenes are well animated and acted. You know, Kojima thinks he's Hollywood material, despite the fact that he's making like some of the dumbest stories ever made. Everything looks great. It all works really well. Everything is functioning great. It's got great presentation and production values. I will say there's a little too many menus to traverse a lot of the time. Getting into the game, I had like 13 screens to go through. And often post-mission, you can have upwards of 13 soldiers volunteering or people you've extracted. And while you can skip it, going through it individually to see what you got is kind of interesting, but it takes forever. So sometimes the game forces you to look at something on your iDroid and you literally cannot proceed until you've looked at it. This is fine as like a tutorial for some things, but it started showing up more and more, and it was stuff like online events that I had no interest in at all. And the fact that it forced me to look at them was pretty damn annoying. I think the Phantom Pain is actually a lot easier overall than Ground Zeroes. A lot of that comes from enemy placements, the open world giving you huge areas to snipe and infiltrate from, and character and weapon progression systems. Ground Zeroes had a fairly tight facility with pretty dense enemy placements, so when you go from that into even larger facilities with more sparse enemy placements, it can be really easy. The difficulty does go up quite a bit as the game goes on, and later missions can be quite difficult to get through with pure sneaking, but overall, I feel like it wasn't anything too difficult. It never felt like I was in a position where I couldn't beat something. I always felt like I'd get through it. So a lot of the reduced difficulty comes from your expanded combat options, you know, the buddy system, your greatly improved arsenal, access to better uniforms and upgrades, your core abilities like movement speed and reflex mode. D-Dog makes sneaking ridiculously easy, and Quiet gives you a lot of fire support and shootouts, which is also really useful. The increased reflex mode time really makes it feel excessive. I think once upgraded it's 7 seconds, which sounds like not a lot, but it really is in the context of a QuickTime event. You know, the increased movement speeds and increased health are nice, but they also make things feel really easy. You know, the increased sprint speed means you can close distance on enemies really fast and abuse your CQC. And the increased health from upgrades like Battle Dress can trivialize a lot of encounters through sheer attrition. The same goes for the increased health regeneration on the sneaking suit. It makes it a lot easier to survive encounters you probably wouldn't have otherwise. So I didn't utilize a lot of the mother-based support options like the helicopter or the artillery, except on one specific mission. Well, you know, besides supply drops, because they're basically mandatory. You know, if you want to use suppressors, you basically have to get supply drops, but they also completely trivialize the game. So supply drops really trivialize the game. The duration of your suppressors is irrelevant when you can just call down a supply drop and get another one, you know, nearly on top of you at basically no GMP cost. The whole idea of suppressor duration is rendered moot when you can just resupply whenever you need to. It's a very similar problem to the Fulton Extract. It's the same kind of problem in that the mostly outdoor environments don't limit you at all. If you're in an indoor environment, you can't utilize supply drops and you can't utilize the Fulton. Since most of MGS5 is outdoors, that never is an issue. You can swap loadouts, you can swap uniforms, you can swap buddies. You never need to use what you have to adapt to the situation. You can just swap it out for the optimal equipment at that moment. The only part I really struggled with was the last battle in Quiet's storyline where you have to fight a huge amount of enemy tanks. It was easily the most difficult part of the entire game. It made fights like Sahelanthropus and the skulls look like a total joke. I had to use everything in my arsenal to beat it. Supply drop to swap from sneaking suit to battle dress, shoot a huge amount of rockets, call and support helicopters and artillery, and just flat out grind attempts until I got one that finally stuck. The final mission leading up to Sahelanthropus can be pretty difficult again, mostly because of enemy density and a lot of tanks. I did replay it to capture footage and I destroyed everyone in there with rockets, so you know, maybe not as hard as I remember. So the game isn't super easy, and you can die really easily if you get caught, but I think it's really forgiving, I guess. If you get caught, you've got like 7 seconds of reflex mode to try and avoid the alert. Sneaking is really forgiving in the sneaking suit, and your buddies and upgrades can pick up a lot of the slack at your skill level. So there's some clear pacing issues with Metal Gear Solid 5. I really think that Ground Zeroes is intended to be played immediately before the Phantom Pain. And if you play it that way, you have a very good introduction with Ground Zeroes, followed by an hour and a half of needlessly boring exposition and on-rails gameplay. The hospital segment of the Phantom Pain is actually terrible, which is why it's disgusting that if you want the truth ending, you have to play it twice. After the initial slog, the game does pick up. I think since the gameplay is so well done, it kind of gives you the illusion that it's a really good and exciting story. But after the 15-hour mark, the illusion starts to break down. You're kind of wondering what you're doing and what the point of all of it is. So a lot of the problems with the Phantom Pain are just the sheer amount of repetitive content. You know, you're frequently doing the same tasks over and over. You're frequently waiting for helicopters to pick you up and drop you off. Missions mostly fall into the same handful of tasks that must be completed. You know, find the VIP, extract this guy. It's all the same, right? Side-ups are by far the biggest offender of this. You know, I was doing destroy the walking puppets, and you wait what feels like ages for the helicopters, and you finish the side-up in what feels like under 60 seconds. So get used to hearing that little tidbit. The most glaring and obvious piece of repetitive content is the mission selection via the ACC. It always falls into the same category. You select the mission and start, you wait for the helicopter to land and you get to view Kojima's credits, you get off the helicopter, run to whatever your objective is, do some minor stealth and or combat, most likely extract whoever you're tasked with saving, call another helicopter, run to the LZ, wait for the helicopter to land, you get on, and you watch the cutscene of flying away. It definitely grates on your nerves after a while. It doesn't help that the story is kind of bare bones, and the tasks you're doing feel more like odd jobs for petty cash than anything meaningful. So Ground Zeroes was great because it was really short and sweet. It felt really focused, and, you know, it was intense, and it was exactly the length it needed to be. The Phantom Pain is more of the same, but it feels needlessly drawn out at times. My playthrough to the truth ending took me 35 hours. My rough estimate is that it took me about 10 hours to go from the end of chapter 1 to the truth ending. And you know, honestly, I actually forgot that it said chapter 1 at any point in the game. So I was kind of shocked when after I beat Sahelanthropus and chapter 2 showed up on the screen. I'm not entirely sure how exactly to unlock the truth ending, but I basically spent a large amount of time listening to audio tapes, buying whatever I could from R&D, upgrading Mother Base, and doing every single optional mission I could until I finally unlocked. I went back and played another probably 10 hours to record footage, making my playtime about 45 total. I had a completion of 57% by the end of it, so there is a lot to Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain. So despite what I've been saying, The Phantom Pain is actually really immersive. You know, most of the missions are short, and it has that aspect of, oh, I'll just do one more. Oh, just one more. Oh, just one more. You know, it's really rare to find a game that designed like that succeeds. Often you'll be doing some mission or side ops, and then some new side op will unlock, or something from R&D will finish and you want to test it out. Then you start a new side op or mission, and then that chain kind of keeps going. I actually like it when a game makes me lose track of time. You know, so often stuff feels like a slog, and MGS5 keeps you going. So even though there are pacing issues in retrospect, it doesn't feel that way when you're playing it. I lost a lot of the Phantom Pain footage, and I had to go back and replay a lot, and I found myself falling into the same patterns, you know. Oh, I'll just record this mission. Oh, I should do this other Skulls mission. Oh, I need to record this. Oh, I need to record this. And it just kept going, and that was fun, because even though I've played the game for... My first playthrough at my brother's house was like 35 hours, and then this was like 35, and then I did another like 10 hours. It was all fun, and it felt fresh, even though I was doing the same stuff. So for the story summary, I'm just going to give the cliff notes because there are a lot of minor details that don't really do anything. Big Boss wakes up after like a 9-year coma after the helicopter crash in Ground Zeroes. You know, the doctor renames you Ahab before he gets killed by Quiet. So Boss gets a robot hand, and then you go to rescue Miller alone because Ocelot has better things to do. You have a brief encounter with the Skulls, but you just run away on your tactical espionage horse. So after you rescue Miller, you start rebuilding Mother Base and by kidnapping soldiers and stealing everything that isn't tied down. And you know, you do the occasional odd job for petty cash. So after doing that for a while, you end up fighting Quiet, and you bring her back to Mother Base, or shooting her, doesn't really matter. So somewhere in there you get a young Liquid Snake and some kids in your group, but that plotline goes nowhere, because it's unfinished. So eventually everyone on Mother Base who speaks Kikongo gets sick, and instead of just banning Kikongo, Big Boss and Miller hunt down an old guy who knows about parasites. You shoot some Quiet clones, go into one of the only indoor environments in the game, and find the old Dine himself. You sit down and smoke some peyote with Code Talker, and then he reveals that the parasites can be turned from male to female, using the Wolbachia. So on the way back, you get shot down, kill some skulls, and like magic the infection stops and you go after Skullface. The big finale has you rocket blasting your way through a huge compound followed by an awkward Jeep ride that happens in real time, complete with a musical interlude. After Skullface has spilled his guts about his plan, since it's present nowhere else in the game, you arrive in the hangar containing Sahelanthropus. The man on fire shows up again because he had to be resolved in some way or another and he gets crushed. Not explicitly stated, but most likely Psycho Mantis takes an interest in Eli and Psycho connects him to Sahelanthropus and crushes Skullface and then fights Big Boss because he wasn't happy with getting his ass beat twice in fisticuffs. Then the whole revenge plot is wrapped up and the game is over, except Chapter 2 rolls around. So the Huey ending reveals that Huey was a huge asshole, and at a trial, Big Boss decides that Huey should live because he has to, in the canon. So he gets exiled on a boat so he can drown himself in his family pool after learning that he was cucked by his own son in like 15 years. The Quiet ending has a huge shootout versus tanks, and Big Boss being bitten by a snake. Then Quiet talks on the radio to save him, then she just leaves. A deleted ending concludes Eli stealing Sahelanthropus and the last of the English strain of the parasite being destroyed, with Eli and Psycho Mantis escaping the napalming of the island. The truth ending reveals that Big Boss was actually the booty master the whole time, and Ishmael was the real Big Boss and you were just a phantom or whatever. But you were really the booty master. Honestly, I think Kojima was trying to find a way to outdo himself the entire game. You can't do nanomachines because it's set in the past, so they came up with the vocal cord parasites. You know, their purpose in the plot is also not completely clear. On one hand, Skullface talks about erasing all languages, but on the other hand, his grand scheme involves selling nuclear weapons, but being the only one who can control whether they can detonate. So it's really just like this unfocused kind of mess. You know, it's really sad because even with the stupidness of the vocal cord parasites, the game suffers because it's just not finished. You know, the story's just not finished and it's poorly presented. And so, you know, it's common knowledge at this point that the Phantom Pain just wasn't finished. You know, because a lot of plot lines just don't go anywhere, they probably should have just been cut out completely. If you can't explain Eli, and you know, not explicitly stated, but most likely Psycho Mantis taking a sample of the English strain and Sahelanthropus off to places unknown, you just gotta cut out the scene. You know, you just gotta cut out those scenes. It makes a huge plot hole with the original Metal Gear Solid. And it wouldn't even be hard. You just have to have Boss throw the samples into the fire like he does. And cut out Psycho Mantis from the entire scene. You know, a lot of the scenes with Eli just feel like missed opportunities because it never ends up going anywhere. So Big Boss is the foundation of the events of like the entire Metal Gear saga. It seems to have some kind of connection or impact on like most of the major characters throughout the series. So I thought we'd actually get to see some of these events in meetings, especially with the idea of building an army and training soldiers that's present. I honestly had a lot of predictions about what kind of characters would show up. I kept thinking maybe we'd get a glimpse of a young Sniper Wolf, or Frank Yeager, maybe even a young Raiden, but I wasn't clear exactly where that fits in the timeline. So, you know, when Eli, who's revealed to be part of Les Enfants Terribles, comes in, I was expecting a lot. But nothing happens. You know, there's no meaningful interaction. You know, Eli acts as a pretty uninteresting and non-threatening boss encounter twice, and then he's pretty much absent from the whole game. You know, it's clear that the intention was there to be a lot more going on with Eli, but it got cut. You know, that's one of the biggest problems with the prequels, in my opinion. They always seem to miss the mark. The ending of Metal Gear Solid 3 was perfect. We saw Big Boss lose faith in the United States and most of what he's believed in, and we can fill in the blanks of how he ends up as the villain in the original Metal Gear. Those few scenes were enough. We didn't need a Big Boss trilogy. The Phantom Pain does bridge us to the original Metal Gear, but it does so in a way that feels more like an M. Night Shyamalan twist rather than a series of realistic and probable events. So I had a lot of predictions about who would show up in the Phantom Pain. I was actually really banking on Sniper Wolf. You know, it fits the timeline. She'd be around, I think, 16. You know, she's from Kurdistan, which is fairly close to Afghanistan. You could do some little magic, give her some backstory. Oh, she's running away from conflict there, and she found conflict here. And you know, the thing is, she would actually fit really well in the game as your buddy, as opposed to Quiet. You know, you could have a lot of progression systems. You could have a lot of stuff in there that's actually, you know, meaningful to the gameplay. And you know, in canon, Big Boss uses child soldiers, so it's kind of hard when you make a prequel trilogy and you're trying to make Big Boss the hero when he was the villain. And it kind of ends up being that, you know, it's hard to make a fall story when you're trying to make him a hero. And I think that's where the game falls flat in a lot of ways. So there are some things that just had to happen a certain way. So we know what happens to Huey from what Otacon tells us in Metal Gear Solid 2, so there's no way that he would end up dying in Metal Gear Solid 5. So, you know, when there's the trial and everyone's calling to kill him, you know it's just not going to end that way. That's another thing that's a problem with the prequels, is that you know what's going to happen. You know that this guy can't die, you know that this guy can't die, you know that this guy's going to be fine. All this stuff has to happen for the other games in canon, and that makes it kind of boring. I also guess the truth revelation about midway through. You know, there's also the obvious that Ishmael is also voiced by Kiefer Sutherland, and he says things like, "You're talking to yourself," that are subtle enough to be missed by your average person, but people were calling this revelation from like the E3 reveals. There's some minor tidbits throughout the game, like Eli not being a DNA match to Big Boss, which we know can't be the case because Les Enfants Terribles is about creating the sons of Big Boss. So I think that reveal, that interaction between Ishmael and Ahab, is one of the reasons why David Hayter didn't come back. It would be too obvious if, you know, Ishmael was talking like the classic Snake. It would be too obvious, that reveal. So I think that's part of why Kiefer Sutherland was gone. It's just for that one M. Night Shyamalan style twist. At the beginning of the mission Skullface, Miller literally says, "We don't know what he wants, we have to stop him." Which is really, really terrible storytelling. Then at the end of the mission, you do a walk and talk and sit in the Jeep, and he explains his motivations to you because they haven't been present the entire game. Exposition dumps are terrible. It's really sloppy storytelling. And the plan itself is completely ridiculous to boot. Skullface wants to wipe out language while simultaneously threatening nuclear war. It's completely insane, and his motivations are basically that he had to learn a bunch of languages as a kid. There's also the whole idea of Skullface himself. It's been retconned where he was involved in all the major incidents from MGS3 onwards. You can make Skullface an interesting villain by showing me that he's interesting, not by going around and saying, "Oh, you know, he did all this cool stuff behind the scenes during Operation Sneak Eater." It doesn't work. It's the same thing when they talk about how Kotaka researched the End's remains. Apparently the End wasn't just a random freak like the rest of the Cobra unit, but he had the same parasites that Quiet and the camouflage skulls had. It feels really forced and worthless to the overall plot, and it feels like you're kind of grasping at straws. You need some reason to justify these vocal cord parasites, and you just so happened to look back at MGS3 and be like, "Oh, the End was photosynthetic because I'm crazy." And you took that and you ran with it, and that doesn't sit well with me. Even though it seems like I'm kind of taking a dump on it, I really liked the Phantom Pain. Like, I really did. I think it was fucking great. You know, it starts really slow, but once it gets going, it's really fun and enjoyable. The biggest drawbacks are that it can start to feel repetitive. You know, that being said, at least 15 to 20 hours of really enjoyable gameplay before it starts to feel kind of repetitive. Then another 15 or so of still enjoyable gameplay is nothing to sneeze at. You know, even though I said Mother Base was largely useless, it's fun to get upgrades. It's satisfying to get a new gun, or upgrade your bionic hand. You know, folding people is always funny because of how ridiculous it is and how they scream "wee" as they go up. When you get back to Mother Base, it's fun to punch your soldiers in the face. It's fun to punch enemies in the face. It's fun to punch kids in the face, even though you can't kill them. The major cutscenes and plot revelations can be fun, even if the overarching plot is pretty bad. And so I think there's a lot that could be done to improve the Phantom Pain. You know, Metal Gear Solid 5 is a big game, but I think there's a lot that you could have done to make it a better experience. So the previous Metal Gears had a lot of emphasis on indoor environments, and the Phantom Pain just doesn't. I think the open world environments actually hurt the Phantom Pain quite a bit. MGS1 had Shadow Moses, MGS2 had the Big Shell, MGS3 had less emphasis on indoor environments, but still had a lot, like the Groznygrad complex. You know, indoor environments are actually really good for well-designed enemy encounters. They restrict your movement and force you to adapt your strategies. You know, you can't snipe enemies from 50 feet away indoors. You're inherently closer to the enemy, which adds tension to the gameplay, especially in a stealth game. I honestly think you can have the best of both worlds. You can have the open world that currently exists in the Phantom Pain, but I think you could have added a few really large indoor environments. If you had a few large indoor environments that had to be completed without returning to Mother Base, and maybe a string of missions, it would probably feel more like a Metal Gear game. You know, there's this tonal shift from solo sneaking mission to developing your own army, and it feels really strange. Especially considering you're still doing the solo sneaking missions because Ocelot says only you can do this. So one thing really stands out to me as completely ridiculous and a huge missed opportunity in terms of the gameplay. And it's not being able to do anything with your soldiers on Mother Base besides beat the shit out of them. If you could bring them on missions with you, or call down fire teams to act as distractions so you can sneak around, I think it would help justify kidnapping everyone you come across. It seems like a logical expansion of the buddy system and being able to call down helicopters and artillery support. It seems kind of crazy you're doing everything solo when you have like 300 people on Mother Base just sitting in the waiting room. You know, the combat deployment missions are just handled in spreadsheets again, so it lacks any kind of investment. You know, you just run the stats, send the guys out to whatever resource you want, then forget about it until the little ding comes up on your iDroid. So I kind of wish I could do something more directly impactful with my soldiers, although I think it would make the game even easier as a result. You know, because of that, you never really feel like you're developing a private army. It just feels like you're a one-man army again. Now, I've already talked about the Parasite unit, but I think it deserves another look. You know, it's important to develop the villain alongside the protagonist, which MGS5 fails at. I think you could have adapted the 4 generic skulls of any given type into a single unique character. You know, if you take Quiet as the example compared to the 4 generic sniper skulls, it's at least plausible that this could have worked. You do have multiple encounters with the other 2 groups of skulls. I guess they're called the Mist and Armor variants. And you could use these encounters to give some insight and develop the character, and expand the battles to be more involved and interesting. Obviously you need to adapt some of the encounters with the skulls to compensate for a single enemy as opposed to 4, but that should be fairly trivial to do for a large team. If you adapted it to be a more of a interesting enemy squad, you'd have more potential and time to develop the intent of the villains, and Skullface in particular. You know, like I said earlier, you know, Skullface largely exists only at the end of the game as an exposition dump. And a large portion of the story is locked behind the optional audio tapes. So, if you've been avoiding them throughout the game, intentionally or unintentionally, it feels like Skullface just shows up at the end because they needed to end the game and wrap up the pseudo-revenge plot of Chapter 1. So in conclusion, is the Phantom Pain a good game? Yes. Is it also marred by some problems? Yeah. You know, mainly repetitive content and being unfinished. So do I still recommend it? You know, absolutely yes. You know, Metal Gear Solid 5 is definitely a contender for one of the best games I played in 2015. The open world environment is probably its biggest hurdle, but it's not really apparent until you've played about halfway through the game. You know, it's a great experience, but it leaves a little bit of a bitter taste in your mouth with the lackluster ending and post-Chapter 1 content being kinda spotty at best. But when all's said and done, if you're a fan of shooters or stealth games, you'd be doing yourself a disservice by missing out on the Phantom Pain. These guys look like Teen Wolf.